My name's Dan Fagan, and I'm the director of the Science, Health, and Environmental Reporting Program here at the Carter Institute of Journalism at NYU, which is where this broadcast is originating. I'm also the director of the Science Communication Workshops, and that's actually quite relevant to this new program, the Kavli Conversations. The Science Communications Workshops are 8 years old now, and that's a workshop program aimed at training young investigators in the sciences, teaching them how to reach broader audiences with their work. And of course that pairs well with the journalism program that I direct, which is aimed at training science journalists. So you can see already that there's this interchange between science journalists, journalists who understand science and love it, and scientists who want to reach broader audiences with their work. It's my absolute conviction that a big part of the future of science communication is going to involve a lot of interchange and interaction between these two groups. So with the support of the Kavli Foundation, we have put this program together. This is the first of what we hope will be many, many broadcasts featuring premier science communicators from the world of journalism and the world of science, talking to each other about specific topics and also about the broader issues associated with communicating science in a way that is both accurate but also engaging, that actually reaches people. So it's an honor to have Susie and Gavin with us for the first one, and I will leave it to Lee to formally introduce them, but let me take the privilege of introducing Robert Lee Holtz, science writer at the Wall Street Journal, and also a distinguished writer in residence here at the Carter Institute, who will be the host of the Kavli Conversations. And Lee, please take it away.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. So, welcome all of you to the Kavli Conversations on Science Communication, both you here in the room here at NYU with us and those of you who are joining us via our live interactive webcast. So this is the first in our series of these conversations. They're sponsored by the Kavli Foundation and, as Dan said, by the SHERP program here at NYU. And in the weeks ahead, we're going to be exploring in a series of these conversations the craft of communications in physics, in human origins, in advanced biology, and neuroscience. This evening, we, of course, will begin with climate change. Now, on March 9th, just so you know, we'll sit down with documentary filmmaker Mark Levinson, who's the director of Particle Fever, and physicist Chuck Adler. On April 6th, we'll be talking with genetic engineering pioneer, Harvard University geneticist George Church, and two-time Pulitzer Prize winner Amy Harmon from the New York Times. On April 20th, we'll be with Andrea McDaniels of the Baltimore Sun and NIH brain expert Douglas Fields, who will mull the hidden consequences of inner-city violence. And on May 4th, in the concluding segment, we'll be with noted author and paleoanthropologist Ian Tattersall, the American Museum of Natural History, and Science magazine correspondent Ann Gibbons to talk with them about the very touchy topic of human origins. These all, I should emphasize, will be webcast, and we will encourage those all around the world who are interested in such matters to join us. So here we are now, live from New York. As we go, I encourage the audience here to offer their questions. I really want to emphasize this is a conversation, not a lecture, not a monologue. And those of you who are joining us online, I encourage you to tweet your questions using the hashtag #KavloConvo, which we'll be showing on the screen periodically. So, look, we start this evening, we start our conversation with a single guiding question. What can we learn from when a leading environmental journalist who covers global warming and an eminent climate scientist who reaches out to a mass audience through his own works get together to exchange ideas? What do their differing perspectives tell us here who work in these fields about how the news of science is changing, how it reaches the world, and how we can better accomplish that. I mean, we're here to find out. So, as a journalist, Suzanne Goldenberg is at home in contested terrain. She's an experienced and award-winning war correspondent who's covered conflicts in Lebanon, Iraq, and Palestine. In fact, in 2003, she covered the U.S. invasion of Iraq from Baghdad. She's a native of Canada, and she joined The Guardian in 1988. She's written 3 books, most recently an account of Hillary Clinton's presidential run. She's been The Guardian's environmental correspondent since 2009. She writes frequently about climate change as a key member of one of the world's largest environmental news staffs. As a climatologist, Gavin Schmidt from NASA is himself a veteran science communicator who co-founded a well-respected and award-winning blog called Real Climate, which has really played a key role in brokering a lot of these discussions about climate change over the years. His TED Talk on climate change has been viewed 1 million times. No, wait a minute. Make that 1,054,225 times. In more than 100 research papers, he's studied long-term climate change, past, present, and future, and on how to improve climate models. Since 2014, he's been the director of the NASA Goddard Institute of Space Studies here in New York and the Earth Institute at Columbia University. Now, in many ways, the two of you have a great deal in common. You share a sense of purpose, perhaps a sense of alarm, a very strong sense of the need for concerted action. Now, I wonder, though, if you agree on what, on February 24th, 2016, the climate change story is. Suzanne, I wonder from your perspective as an environmental writer, how would you characterize the story you're covering?
I think we're at a moment now where the story, it's changing. When I took over and when I was interviewed for this job that I now have, the whole question was, well, can you cope with the science? And I don't have a science background, so that was a bit of a lift and a bit of an explanation. But what's happened is that the science has become increasingly clear on the dangers of climate change, and the scientists are increasingly able to link certain effects directly to climate change and certain things that we see around us in real time. And now, since the climate change agreement that was reached in Paris last December, I think we're now at a moment where the whole debate is pivoting away from the science to some extent to what we do with this now, and then it becomes an economic story and a policy story. Now, yes, Republicans in Congress, Republicans on the presidential trail will say that climate change is not occurring, or maybe it's occurring, or maybe it's not human activity. But I think that if you look globally, and I think even if you look within certain sections of the Republican Party, there's really an emerging consensus now that this is increasingly an economic and policy story. But one that's rooted in the science. You can't go home.
So Gavin, now from your vantage point, from your perspective, from your side of the fence that runs between Suzanne and I and you, what's the story? Is it the same story? Or do you see it differently?
So, climate change as a whole is an extremely complex physics, extremely complex causes, extremely complex interactions and impacts, and it's not one story. Right? There are multiple science stories that are ongoing all the time. There are multiple policy stories. There are multiple implementation stories. There are multiple, it's not one thing. And I think when we try and take something that's as complex as this, that has so many different ramifications and sides to it, and just say, well, it's just one story, we're already putting it in an ill-fitting box. So climate is not one thing. It really touches many things. It touches economics, it touches energy policy, it touches just the gee whiz science aspects. It touches our history, how we emerged as a human species. There are climate aspects to that. What's going to happen in the future? Climate is going to intersect many of the things that we're talking about all over the rest of the media. And I think that part of the problem that we've had is that climate has been kind of shoehorned into its own story, when really it's actually a story that is affecting all of the other stories, because almost everything you do is affected by the climate. And the assumptions that we have made that determine, what kind of insulation we have in this building, how close we are to the sea, what kind of food we grow, how we move it around. All of those things are based on assumptions about stationary climates, and that's no longer a safe assumption.
Okay, so what I'm hearing, go.
But that's an economic and a policy story.
Oh yeah, I was just going to say, how big is your shoehorn? I mean,
I'm just saying, for us, if you're trying to sort of tell people where the decisions and the crunch, but everything has to be rooted in the science and the evidence of climate change.
Oh, for sure.
But it's how we deal with it now and how we respond to it much more. I think that's the lens through which I feel that our readers, that's the lens I think our readers need to know about that. What do we do about it now? How is it going to affect my life going forward if I don't do anything, if we don't do anything about it?
That's a lens, but people interact with science and science-based stories and impacts in multiple different ways. I still have people coming to me and talking to me about storm surges and interesting things that happened 55 million years ago. And these are relevant to the conversation that we're having about going forward and making plans, but they're also part of the, oh my God, how do we know that? How has the human enterprise of science led us to understand something about the real world, and that is a fundamental story that people still find absolutely fascinating. So that doesn't disappear because climate change also has economic and policy impacts.
This is interesting, and what I'm hearing here is a fundamental difference in vantage point that's not hard to imagine. But I hear you still sort of clinging to the process, still clinging to the evidence gathering, still wanting to, because you're a modeler, and the modeler has to have all of the pieces in the air at the same time. You may not know, but Gavin Schmidt is a juggler, and I think there's some personal aspect of this that works its way into his science.
Maybe so.
And but you can't write a story about everything at once.
No,
it seems to me.
No.
At least I can't. I don't know about you, Suzanne. So, Suzanne, if you're looking at this table that Gavin has set, I mean, this empirical evidence going back 55 million years about weird things going on in ice cores in Antarctica and cores from Central Africa about sea level change and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, how do you decide from one day to the next to single out the piece for your story, which is, if I'm hearing you right, is the economic and political story?
It's that I'm not saying there's no interest in that, but that is not the driving force. The driving force is how we respond to climate change, whether we, how we adapt to climate change and how we, curtail emissions to limit climate change. That's the focus. That has to be the focus, because I think for me as a journalist and someone who comes from the background that I come from, for me the focus is humans and climate change, and humans living now and humans a few generations away from us.
Right.
Let me sort of just push the question a little forward a bit then. So who, if I may ask, do you think you're writing for? Who's your audience? And I'm going to ask you the same thing, so you're going to...
That's always been really hard for me, and it's becoming harder as The Guardian evolves as a news organization. Because first of all, The Guardian was, I come from an era before the internet, and I was writing for a newspaper that was delivered within the UK, and now we've become more and more global, and within that global framework, we've become local. And it kind of corresponds to climate change because the impacts are local and they're global and in different scales. So it's difficult. I sort of find myself shifting focus sometimes. I know there are stories that I write that are, and I can see the metrics on them because we, at The Guardian, we can see exactly how much traffic we have and how many stories are tweeted and where they're read. There's a heat map. And there's some stories that I will write and they get really big readership in the UK and nothing here. Right. And I think they should be of interest here, but vice versa. There's other stories that do really well here, and I think they have implications elsewhere. So I find myself being local and global at the same time. Or not on the exact same story, but local and global. You have to sort of straddle both those worlds.
So when you reach out to the public, which you do in a
Right.
variety of different ways, including your own climate science community,
Yes.
which you do through the blog. Who are you trying to reach, and to what purpose?
So that's a very good question. To what purpose? When I first started becoming interested in talking about science kind of outside of our lab or outside of conferences, it was very much in a line of, this person has got something wrong. I'll help them out. I'll write a letter and point out where their error is. And I remember the first few times I did that, and it didn't go as I anticipated.
Yeah, what happened?
So this my first letter to the editor. It was for New York Press, which used to be a free. I don't know if it's still around, but it used to be a free newspaper competing with Village Voice here in the city. And they had a journalist, and he'd read some like totally messed up interpretation of a paper that had just appeared in Nature, I think, and he got it totally wrong, and I said, no, you got it wrong. All your conclusions here, actually it's backwards. This is actually a real triumph. It demonstrates that the greenhouse effect exists, and you should. This was a triumph of modeling and observation. It was great. And they printed my letter, and then there was like another whole page of how my agenda was totally showing through my words, and that my ways to spin this obviously wrong result was like just a total mess. It was, and I was going, why did you do that? Why didn't you just agree with me that you got it wrong? And as that developed, I realized very quickly that this is a politicized conversation out in the public, and I got a lot better very quickly in terms of how to deal with that. And then I started thinking, well, what is it that I'm actually trying to achieve, right? And I've thought about that quite deeply over the years that I've been doing this. And I think the key thing is to help people have better conversations about this, because it's an important conversation. And if we spent just a little less time talking about nonsense, we might, in the end, make better decisions.
But you reserve the right, as a scientist, to adjudicate the nonsense.
Oh, of course.
Okay.
So
this
is the big difference between journalism and science.
Please.
Oh,
please.
No.
Please.
We are pretty clear. There's certain nonsense. We don't put up with nonsense either.
Right.
Our paper was among the first to say we will not go out and get quotes from the climate deniers, just to say we've heard from the other side, because it isn't an aside. It isn't a legitimate point of view. It isn't a valid point of view rooted in evidence. So, I don't put up with nonsense.
Right, but I feel no embarrassment. I mean, I have my expertise. People quote me all the time. People ask me questions. I don't feel any hesitancy in telling people what I think about things. Right? And I don't need to authoritize it by asking somebody else what they think when I think it, and I have the credibility to say what I think. So, so one of the things that I can do that other people can't is, you see something come across the transom, you say, no, I'm sorry, that's nonsense, or that's great, or that's a really nice thing that you're doing because it really ties in with this huge context over here, which actually didn't get into the story. But
all right, let me see what we've got from our
that was quick.
online group.
Oh, yeah.
We've got a question from Twitter, which is, with such a politically charged topic, how do you keep politically neutral when covering climate change?
Suzanne.
Well, I don't see it as political. It is something that's politically charged in this country. But I mean, so much of what I write about is actually stories that affect people or that affect the negotiations. So I am not aware of it being very politically charged all the time. I mean, let me see what, I was in Abu Dhabi. I wrote a story about the so-called world's first green city. Well, it turned out they decided they didn't want it to be so green after all. So that's not politics. They said it was going to be one thing. Now they admit it's another. So it's, I don't, unless you're talking about the political process, I don't think everything's laden with politics. And I think there's
yeah.
some evidence-based reporting there, right? When you're talking about the science, it's not political. When you're talking about the reality of the effects, it's not political.
Right, but let me follow up with our friends on Twitter. It is very much a social justice story, for instance.
I do think that.
Yeah, so in that sense, I mean, in a kind of, if we take sort of the political out of party labels and use the word political to kind of encompass a broader humankind, I know you believe very strongly that climate change is not just a science story, but it's also a social justice story.
Absolutely.
What do you mean?
Absolutely. Well, by that I mean that climate change is its effects are going to be unequal. Climate change is going to fall more heavily on certain people than others, and that corresponds to people's position within society and the positions of different countries, the degree of prosperity within countries. And I think we need to be conscious of that. And I think going forward, we need to be conscious of the fact that there are going to be solutions or put in place or policies that may be unfair for people, and I think my role as a journalist is to sort of call that out. So you're going to see that, I think, a lot in this country going forward when you talk about people with fancy properties along coastlines and sea level rise. So do people get covered by state finance insurance scheme when their beachfront house gets swamped, or do people, do we bail out, billionaires with fancy houses, or do we bail out sort of poor people who live in low-lying areas? I mean, what do we do as a society? And I think it's my role to sort of talk about that quite a lot, and to make sure, or try and make sure, that people are conscious of the choices they're making and what kind of effects they're going to have.
Well,
let me address that as well. So there is a politicized dimension to talking about science in public. When it comes to this topic, in the same way that there's a politicized dimension in talking about evolution and creationism or genetically modified foods, depending on where you are in the world. And that means that when you go out in public, and this is, I think, a shock for scientists when they first kind of put their head above the parapet, whether it's because they've just had a big paper or they're trying something out. Suddenly, instead of people being relatively nice and talking about science and talking about evidence, people are screaming at you from Twitter or from social media for no reason that you can discern, other than you've suddenly become symbolic of something much, much larger. And that kind of tribalism, that kind of mob mentality that can sometimes occur, it can be very, very troubling. And you have to A, be prepared for that, and B, know that it's got absolutely nothing to do with you particularly, and that you're just really symbolic of something else that's annoying a lot of people.
Do you think that's something that's been really hard for scientists? Because you've seen over the last few years, you have seen for some scientists, they've sort of had this sort of bunker mentality, perhaps, and they felt that they're under siege, which they have been.
Right.
But has it affected, scientists' sort of willingness to take positions, either by making scientists act in more political ways than they might have otherwise, or it seems to me like it's been pretty traumatic for some scientists.
So I think that's right. For some scientists, it really depends. Like, if people shower you with abuse for things that you actually haven't done, or for opinions you don't actually hold, that's a shock. And some people wear it well, and it just goes off. It's not me. These people are just crazy. Other people take these things very personally, and sometimes the abuse can actually become very, very personal. And it's designed, in fact, to make you shut up and to make you go away and to make you retreat back into the ivory tower. Some people, when challenged like that, say, no, damn it, I'm going to continue to talk because you don't want me to, right? So if somebody has a shoot the messenger strategy, like, some of the messengers are going to go and say, well, no, damn it, I'm going to continue. And other people say, well, it's not worth my time. Like, I don't need this abuse. I just want to go back and play with my kids or do the work that I'm actually supposed to.
Right, so you do play with your kids, and I'm going to ask Suzanne a variation of this in just a second. So why many scientists think that their proper place is in the ivory tower, or in a startup, trying to patent something.
Right.
But you in particular have not just kept your head above the parapet, but I mean, you've kind of swung one leg over and you're sort of sitting on the parapet, where you're a very easy target. And so I'm curious.
I've been trying to slim a little bit. That's
No, I didn't say you were a big target. I said you were an easy target. So, but yes, you are a big target. As
personal comment.
As am I. As am I. So. What I wonder, though, is, many scientists just simply don't see this as their place. They see this as kind of stepping outside the bounds of their own research to, become advocates in perhaps an unseemly way. So
this is something that I've thought about
what are you doing here?
A lot. Not everybody. There is a certain talent in communication, right? There's a craft to it. A craft is a better terminology. When I first started doing this, I wasn't very good. Now I think I'm better, though obviously I'm not perfect. I have a group of people that work in my institute, about 150 people. I would say, maybe 10 or maybe 20 at the max are people who would be happy even a little bit going outside of what they're actually being paid to do. Because the thing is, we're not actually paid to do public communication. We're paid to do research, we're paid to write papers, we're paid to mentor students. Public communication, the greater understanding of science in the public, informing journalism, all of that stuff is basically extracurricular activity. And not everybody chooses to do it. Other people choose to do other things with their time, and that's okay. Not all scientists have to be mass communicators. A few do need to do it. And I think we need a deeper bench than we actually currently have, and we could discuss why that bench isn't deeper. But it doesn't need to be everybody, and I don't think that it should be incumbent on people who are paid to do one job for them to suddenly be an expert in another job as well.
I just want to take another question, please.
Yeah. So a question from Twitter is, how has the fossil fuel divestment movement impacted the climate change narrative?
And actually, I would like to think that's an excellent question. That was something that leads into something I was going to ask Suzanne about. People will say, and often do, well, that's great, Gavin, that you've taken on this public advocacy role, but that undercuts your objectivity as a scientist, and so I need to keep a closer eye on you. Suspicious fellow. And in the same way, Suzanne, The Guardian, of course, unlike many large media organizations, has really taken upon itself to embrace climate change and fomenting for action, constructive action, to adapt or to stave off as a kind of fundamental institutional purpose. And The Guardian stands out for this, and it's done some quite remarkable things in recent years. And one of them, to our question from our webcast audience, was an effort to persuade people to divest their fossil fuel holdings, the Gates Foundation in particular, and I know there was another
Wellcome.
The Wellcome Trust, a very, very large UK thing. So that The Guardian drew crosshairs and a bullseye on these two groups and said, our goal as a media organization is to get you to change your investment policies. That's a very strong advocacy stance, and I'm wondering now, as a reader, as a viewer, how does that affect, you think, the degree to which I should feel comfortable trusting your objectivity as a journalist?
It's a fair question. I mean, the backdrop to that was, that the scientists sort of agreed that we cannot go and burn all the fossil fuels that are in the ground without triggering a climate catastrophe. And in fact, the majority of fossil fuels cannot be burned with current technology, or we will get to that point. So that's the backdrop of that. And there's some internal Guardian thinking about why we decided to start that now. And it's true, there was a lot of discussion within the news organization as well. I was at some of the sort of planning retreats for that, and there were people, who were really concerned about a backlash from the fossil fuel industry, from our readers, etc. But then it was decided that, well, that this was a stand we were going to take, and that there's a very strong tradition of campaigning journalism in the UK, and that we were taking that position and following in that tradition. So from the British point of view, it's not that outlandish. From the US point of view, it is. But there is a tradition of that. The Guardian has had a number of other campaigns, and they sort of, to support the National Health Service, about FGM and things of that nature. So it doesn't come out of nowhere for us, and so that, or out of the British tradition. So it's rooted in that. That said, I remember, there was a backlash initially, because I remember I wrote a story about something, and to do with Exxon. And I sent Exxon, I was phoning them and emailing them for a comment, and Exxon came back and said, I'm not going to talk to you because you're not objective about climate change, which I thought was kind of funny, coming from the world's biggest oil company that has, funded climate denial and climate misinformation. But after that, I do now get comments from Exxon, and they respond. So there was a sort of immediate backlash from some people. There was a lot of conversation here on the Society for Environmental Journalism, on that website. There were people questioning it. I feel comfortable personally with that decision, though, that we did take to campaign.
And why is that, if I just want to follow up and then?
Because of the tradition that it's rooted in, because for British journalism there is that tradition for campaigning, and because the fact is true that we cannot sort of burn all the fossil fuels, and that if you were going to to put a target on certain people, it actually made sense to target foundations that were trying to do the right things in a way, because you're sort of saying, look, you're spending all this money to alleviate poverty, to improve human health, and yet if you're linked with the fossil fuel industry, if you're putting money into those projects, you're sort of working against your own interests.
And was that campaign successful by your?
Ultimately, it was not. It was Bill Gates is not committing to divest, but he is sort of focused much more on energy and talking much more on energy. You could, can I say he's doing that because of us? He put money into renewable energy. I have no idea. But no, they did not come out and say, yes, we're divesting.
Gavin, you wanted to say something?
Right, so I wanted to talk about advocacy in general. So this idea that scientists are these kind of pure, objective automata is a nonsense, right? Scientists are people. They're also citizens. They have opinions. Just sit around.
I'm very shocked here, Gavin.
Yeah, no, you see,
because I was raised to believe by scientists that you all were an objective, cool, empirically driven bunch.
So, hey, but you're an investigative journalist. You should have already seen that was not actually true. So there is this mythos, right, about science, and we're all about the noble, objective search for truth. Right. Yeah, there's a little bit of that, but we also have huge egos, and and we're very, very competitive, and we have a joy in finding something out about the real world, and we have a pain when somebody takes what we do and totally misrepresents it. So if you actually ask people if you actually ask scientists what they're happy to advocate for, and I did this at a big conference, it was like 400 people in the audience or so, and I did a poll. So are you happy to advocate for more education, better education, science education?
Right, and you asked people to raise their hands,
and everybody said yes. So there was the problem with advocacy. Did you want to advocate for more research funding for your field? Everybody said yes, right? That's also a political statement, right? That's not an objective statement. Do you want to advocate for better understanding of climate change in the media? Everybody puts up their hand. It was only by the time I got to geoengineering, were you going to advocate for a geoengineering solution, that only then, most people didn't put up their hands. So people are happy to advocate, and they're happiest to advocate when they think everybody agrees with them. So.
All right, but what are we supposed to derive from that? I mean,
so you're supposed to derive from that advocacy per se is not a bad thing. What people should be clear about is what they're actually advocating for. If I'm advocating for a disinvestment campaign, I will say I'm advocating for a disinvestment campaign. I don't generally, right? I don't advocate on political topics. I don't advocate for particular solutions. People ask me my opinion. I have opinions, but they're not particularly well formed, other than I know what people are talking about. But I do advocate for having a proper conversation about science and not talking about nonsense. Right? Nobody in the history of the world.
We're back to that word again. You're going to insist on the primacy of facts. That's the next thing I can see.
Not facts. Context.
Context.
For a long time in the early 2000s, we had all these talking heads, people who knew nothing about science, talking about 15th century tree rings. Nobody in the history of the world has ever decided anything based on a 15th century tree ring, not even in the 15th century. Right? So why is that a topic of conversation on a political talk show? It's not, it's just nonsense. It's a proxy argument for things that are actually kind of interesting. So why aren't we having those conversations? And I think advocating for people to have conversations about things that matter, as opposed to things that are just proxy conversations for things that don't matter, is a valuable advocacy position. And I'm totally happy that if you think that my science is compromised because I want people to talk about things that are sensible, then that's your prerogative. But I don't see that follows.
That's a good question. You've been very patient. Thank you.
Coming from the other direction, as a scientist who engages with the public and writes, how do you feel your experiences with that inform your research and the way you look at your own, internally at your own work?
That's a good question.
So one of the things that I've really got out of talking more widely is getting a much better sense of the things that matter, right? A lot of the work I've done kind of follows from the work that I did before and the work that the rest of the community is doing. But then a lot of the higher profile stuff that I've done has been based on conversations with the public, things that I put out there, questions that have come back, and then like kind of, so what? And then really diving in. What is the real issue here? Sometimes it's been based on people totally getting something wrong, and I'm thinking, why did they get that wrong? And then I look and I try and find, the piece of science or the real contextualization that demonstrates why that's wrong. And I kind of knew it was wrong, but there was actually nothing. And so I said, we'll do that study. And we did that study, and it suddenly becomes like a big deal. And they go, we should have done that ages ago. Yeah. And so it's informed my science. It's informed the kinds of things that we do that make a difference to the wider conversation.
So it's a kind of feedback mechanism for you as a researcher.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, no, it's definitely steered us in certain directions, and obviously away from others because we only have a finite amount of time.
So I want to ask Suzanne a question. I want to go back to his use of the word nonsense, which is a powerful word, and it's one that gets tossed around by all sides. In one way or another in this conversation about climate change that's been ongoing since, the late 1980s, at least.
For sure.
By my own experience. And recently there's been a lot of talk when we consider how to better communicate the facts about climate change, about sort of neuroscience issues, framing, cognition. How do people really take in information? Well, if they really had the right frame, if we change the way, then they'll get it. They won't simply sort of keep absorbing this nonsense. I mean, do you think that that's like our business? Do you worry about sort of like the neural impact of like how you approach a story, Suzanne?
Me, I have to say it's less so now, but in the last sort of couple years since Obama has made climate change such a big issue, and he has sort of put it back on the radar, but the public radar. But I mean, when I first came to the beat, you had people, angsting about this all the time. We're not framing it properly. There's too many facts and this or that and the other.
Yeah. We need more nonsense.
More nonsense, more terms. Let's call it global weirding. Let's not call it climate change. Let's call it climate disruption and this, that, and the other.
Yeah.
I'm just not that interested in that particular debate. I think as a journalist, you frame things in a way that is interesting and relevant to people. It doesn't, and connects with people on a human level. I'm not going to worry about what sort of terminology I use, and I'm not that interested really in the sort of polling that's been done by different political parties and whether to say climate change or global warming or this, that, or the other. For me, if you tell relevant human stories, people will be interested.
Can I respond to that?
Now I'm juggling. So to you, Gavin, sir.
So it totally depends on context, right? So if I'm in a conversation with somebody and they have a particular opinion, they're coming from a particular place, like listening to where they're coming from and actually thinking about how to make the story relevant to them is the art of conversation, right? It's not, just like reading somebody the abstract of my paper is not a useful and effective way of communicating. So communication, now when you're doing like broadcasts, okay, well, it's much harder because you don't know who you're really talking to. But when you're talking to a room full of people, when you're talking to a room full of policymakers, or you're talking to an individual person at dinner, or you're talking to a bunch of high school kids, you need to adapt what you're saying so that it connects to them, which is, I think, the same as what you're saying. But it's not like tweaking your message in order to get it past somebody's cognitive filter. But you have to do something, because if you actually ask people how much they understand about this problem, they know nothing. Nothing.
Still.
People don't even know what clouds are made of, right? They don't know what greenhouse gases are. They get confused with the ozone hole. They think that acid rain is caused by climate change. They have no idea. And everybody has an awareness of this issue now. So if people have heard of climate change, right? It's up in the 80s and 90s of the sense. If you actually ask them to know like 2 actual essential things about it, most people don't know anything, and they don't know where to go to get better information. They actually know that they're ignorant.
Well, so what we're talking,
there's a role there for people who know stuff to talk about stuff.
So what we have here then, to paraphrase the Paul Newman movie, is a massive failure of communication. Whose is it? Is it because journalists like Suzanne and I, who have been in different ways covering this since Jim Hansen first sat down before a congressional committee and started warning us about heat waves, or is it your fault?
It's teachers. It's the education system.
It's the education system.
I don't think it's teachers, but it's the education system and the education policies. Why isn't there any, 1 hour, I think, there was that study that came out that,
Right.
A lot of high school kids get like less than 1 hour a year on climate change in an academic year. How are you supposed to know anything?
But I mean, the thing is, they don't just not know about climate change. They don't know about anything, right? So,
all right.
That's a bit sweeping.
Okay, so if the NSF does a survey every year, and they ask people, do you know what the primary composition of air is? 20% of people know the answer. The answer is nitrogen, by the way. 20% of people know what we're breathing, right? That's nonsense. The fact that people don't know stuff is extremely disturbing to me. Now, do they need to know that? Well, sometimes. Yeah. And when it comes to people who are now proposing policies and changes to their lives, to their electricity supply, to their this, they need to know why this is being done. And if they don't understand why it's being done, they see it as a personal affront to them, they see it as a personal affront to their community, and you end up in a situation where all we're talking about is the politicization of a topic instead of the actual topic and the actual consequences and the actual actions that we might be able to do to avoid it.
Someone might, you're blaming it on the high school teachers.
I'm not blaming it on the high school teachers. The whole you could argue that the whole American education system, even though people say that they're emphasizing STEM, education, it's not there yet.
Right, but most people haven't been to school in 30 years, right?
Yeah,
when was the last time you were in high
I want to
school?
say
so this is a brand new topic, and how do
this
people
is a conversation about communication, and
Right.
if people aren't listening and aren't learning and aren't hearing, surely the people on this podium have a responsibility to shoulder. And now that I've guilt-tripped you, I want to take a question.
Sure. This is a question from Twitter. It's, shouldn't journalists address climate change denialism when it's rooted in rational concerns about unfair policy impacts, and how?
Very interesting question.
I would love to talk about the policy. I think the reason why climate denial was why there was funding for climate denial, why it was pushed as an agenda, was so that you would not have to have conversations about policy.
I agree.
And so that you would not have to have conversations about regulation and government. So it's not, I'm pretty sure that Jim Inhofe knows that climate change, you know, in the Senate, Mr. Snowball, knows that climate change is occurring and it's primarily caused by human activity. He's actually really concerned about black carbon, for example. He does care about certain environmental issues, but he does not want to deal with, you know, that, or get to that conversation about, okay, this is a problem, what do we do about it? Oh, yes, it's going to involve government, because I'm a small government guy. So in order not to have that conversation, you've got the conservative movement and industry sort of putting up this big smoke screen, literally smoke screen, saying, you know, we don't have to deal with this because it's not real and it's not really a problem. But it's a fake. It's a big misdirection.
Right. And, you know, in broad outlines, we could all agree on that, but the question there also contained a kind of a seed of something slightly different, which was that when it threatens genuine interests, you know,
yes,
is it not important to listen to the people whose ox is being gored, or however that?
I try and say when I talk about it is people who, you know, deny the existence of climate change and oppose government regulations to deal with climate change. I think it's really important to sort of say that and to talk about how it's part of the conservative or free market agenda, perhaps, in some places, rather than to sort of get into the debate, is it real, is it not, you know, because it's real. But I think I do try and talk about the political underpinnings.
Right, so let's take a very direct example. Coal miners in West Virginia.
Sure.
Okay? Climate change policy is not going to be good to them, right? But it's not their fault. Right? They grew up there.
Actually, can I just say that climate change policy is not the problem for coal miners in West Virginia.
But hold on. Can I just finish my point?
Wyoming coal.
So there are, you know, coal miners in West Virginia, in Kentucky. They rightly see a threat to their livelihood because of all of the things that are pushing coal away from generation in the U.S. The weird thing is that there is legislation that gets proposed to help them out, to properly fund their pensions, to give them retraining, but it gets vetoed by the same people that are saying that climate change is not a problem. Mitch McConnell vetoed a bill that would help the coal miners in Kentucky deal with the fact that their industry is dying, at the same time that he's saying that there isn't a problem.
But I think
that's crazy.
Yeah.
But I think you have to be really upfront and say that the reason that coal mining is dying in West Virginia and Kentucky has nothing to do with climate change regulations or the so-called war on coal. It has to do with the natural gas, and it has to do with the availability of much cheaper coal in Wyoming and Montana. And the reasons that coal miners are out of work goes back 30 years or more to highly mechanized coal mining. So I think that's important in terms of addressing, you know, climate denial.
Okay, no, I'm going to take
so I mean that's fine.
Yep,
I mean,
sorry. Please.
So you talked about having proxy arguments and proxy conversations. So what specific conversations do you think people are avoiding?
So it depends on the level. At the federal level, people are avoiding conversations at all about what they should be doing. And the efforts that are being made by EPA or by the administration are just being totally pushed off the agenda in Congress. At the state level, regionally, we're having those conversations. At the city level, we're having those conversations. They're having great conversations about both mitigating emissions in the city and adapting to the changes that are inevitably going to happen anyway, dealing with sea level rise in the city. There's a lot of places where they're not having those conversations because it's been shut down. A lot of places in Texas, we're not talking about the impacts of really long-term extended droughts. Because it's not. That's just noise. Next year it'll be better. Right? So
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, that's fine.
Yeah, no, I would agree very much with Gavin, and that you're not looking. And I think in the Southwest, especially, I would in Arizona, in Arizona, New Mexico, and California, you have to start thinking about climate change is coming on top of all these really bad decisions and unsustainable decisions that have been made over time. So, for example, can you continue to have people migrate to an area that doesn't have a lot of water and use all that water for agriculture in an area when there's going to be less rain and less water? You know, we're not dealing with that.
Earlier spring melts and not so much summer thing. So the Colorado River, right? Anybody that's in the Colorado River Basin should be talking about climate impacts on water resources, because that's going to be the defining issue for them for decades.
And mosquitoes. We need to start thinking about mosquitoes much more, in a way, we think about dengue, and now there's focus on Zika, but there has to be a much more concentrated look at disease and health impacts from climate change.
Okay, so let me brush it back for a second. And we've been talking kind of about the policy aspects of this story, which are important.
See?
And, all right. But it's also a running research story. I mean, there are papers that come out this week that are incremental advances on papers that come out next week that are rowing back on papers that came out 2 years ago. And that is kind of the bread and butter of conventional science journalism.
Yes.
And I wonder, when a story becomes this heated as an economic policy and international relations science story, what happens to that running research story?
Oh, it's totally distorted.
It's totally distorted.
Oh, yes, of course. So there are arguments that are the perceived arguments that are in the public. Then there are the real arguments in the science that are about generally much more subtle issues. When you have a result and you want to get it into one of the big science journals, they have a criteria that says, is this going to be of interest to the general public? Things that are of interest to the general public are often the things that are associated with this kind of weird debate that's happening in the public that really isn't very connected to the science. Stuff that projects onto that gets an easier pass into the high-profile journals. Then it's written about basically depending on how it projects onto that perceived argument. And so people write to that. They get very surprised when suddenly their article, which they thought was a science article, now becomes a political issue. And then you have this like kind of...
So I make sure I understand, then I want to ask Suzanne about the same question, but I want to make sure I understand what you're telling us. So what you're saying is that above and beyond any public communication you may be doing as a scientist on this issue, that this conversation, this debate, this political back and forth is actually altering the nature of the research communications that you have.
Yes, absolutely.
For the better or for worse?
Generally for the worse. Sometimes it helps, but generally it's not useful.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So Suzanne, you're a very sophisticated conflict reporter, if I could put it that way. I mean, the climate debate hasn't quite gotten to the stage where people are actually shooting at each other, but it may not be far off.
Let us hope not.
I wonder, from your standpoint as an environmental writer, again, the same thing, that there's a running research story that's kind of underneath and parallel to this broader climate story. In other words, the story of the fits and starts of advancing research in this area. Is that something you've had to abandon?
No, that's still a strand. I look at, coverage is sort of, you're pulling lots of different strands,
mm-hmm.
right, and knitting them together, and that's obviously one of the strands, that you continue to follow. But I agree with Gavin, is that more and more, even when we're looking at the stuff that does make it into the journals, we sort of say, well, is this really big or is this incremental? And if it's sort of reaffirming what we already know, what we've reported, we are inclined increasingly to leave it.
See, so this is the problem. But it's a problem. Almost all science is incremental, with very rare exceptions, like the gravitational waves that were detected in September, or the Higgs boson. Almost all science is incremental. Like the 99.999% of it is like normal science in that kind of Kuhnian sense. And if we said, okay, well, we're never going to report on anything that's just an incremental advance, you'd never report on anything. You'd be stuck with Pluto, the Higgs boson, and gravitational waves.
Well,
right? But Pluto is so last week.
Yeah,
Pluto is so last week. No,
but that in a crux is the issue with communicating climate change.
Right.
Is that journalism is about reporting stuff that is new and that is
that
new
is
to
news.
readers and
Absolutely.
that is happening.
Right.
And you're talking about a story that is unfolding very slowly.
So we have
fast and slowly in terms of the 24-hour news cycle, right? So there is that inherent conflict there.
Yeah,
true.
It's a fault line, right? This imperative that the news media has to have things that are news, right? Which makes perfect sense. And the fact that most science on this issue is totally incremental and hasn't changed from one day to the other, and all of the news pegs that you use are kind of phony, right? It's a meeting. Okay, there's a big meeting, and so we'll have an explainer about what they're talking about. So in the run-up to Paris, there was a whole bunch of like, well, what does this 2-degree target mean, right? When there's a paper that gets embargoed and is in Nature or Science, okay, well that's a news peg that we can use, and that you can tell your editor, oh, I have to write a story today and not tomorrow or not yesterday because it's coming.
I can see your frustration with that, but you cannot disregard the importance of timing and when people are ready to hear a story. Because
I'm not criticizing it.
I'm
just saying that this is the situation.
I'm hearing frustration.
Please,
I understand it, but. And as journalists as well, you will write something. I'm sure everyone has had this as a journalist, that you'll write a story and it'll just, sink like a stone.
Right.
But somebody else will write a story in another newspaper, same story, and because of the timing, because people are looking at it, it'll just take off.
Right.
And so timing is critical, and those kind of meetings are critical. And I think more and more, in a digital age where people are looking for the news they want, that is critical. Right, because there's no serendipity anymore. People aren't sort of reading through a newspaper. They're not going to their news site, less and less. They're not going to the news site to look for stuff they want. They're just looking for what they know to be there.
Well, actually, there's a lot of stuff. If you follow social media, you look at your Facebook feed or your Twitter feed, there's a lot of totally random stuff that comes up.
But you're following specific people who you have already vetted.
Yes, so it's a curated stream, but there's still a lot of serendipity. I mean, it's not the same as like, oh, there's an article here that was totally unconnected to this story. I agree.
Curated serendipity is a concept that physicists should be investigating.
I agree.
We have a question here?
Sure. When is it appropriate for the climate conversation to switch from prevention to adaptation, and how should this shape coverage?
When is it appropriate? Interesting word.
It depends who you're talking to. If you're talking to people who are in the business of supplying energy, then it's almost all about prevention. If you're in the business of talking to people who run a big city like New York City, it's almost all adaptation. And for different groups at different times, it's going to be a mixture of the two.
But as a scientist who speaks out on this issue, when is it appropriate, to use that word, for you as a scientist to switch from trying to explain the problem more and more loudly, more and more clearly, more and more cleverly, but switch gears from being the explainer or the arbiter of the nonsense to pushing a particular solution or adaptation? When is that appropriate for you as a scientist communicator?
But it's not appropriate for me because, like for a lot of these things, I have no idea how any particular community should better prepare for this. It's not my field. I don't. I know a lot about this issue because I've been in it for decades. But when it comes to understanding the climate impacts on the apple harvest in upstate New York, I'm totally clueless. So, why would they be asking me anything about that? So, the people who you want to ask those different questions are different people. They're not one person. Just because I'm a climate scientist doesn't mean I'm an expert in everything from energy policy to new technology to adaptation in Bangladesh.
It doesn't mean that. But because you're a very articulate and gifted communicator, you command attention.
I wish.
No. 1 million plus views on a 15-minute TED Talk.
Talking
is
about,
a metric.
Talking about climate modeling and simulation, right? I mean, but it wasn't an everything talk, right?
Yeah.
I curate what I say in public because I don't think that I know everything, and so I try and focus my efforts on the advocacy that I think I can do, and that involves talking about the science and trying to get people to talk intelligently about the science.
Suzanne, a variation of the same question for you.
I think what you're getting at is that there used to be this idea that if you talk about adaptation, that was a kind of a surrender, And if you talked about adaptation, it meant that you weren't still trying to cut emissions that cause climate change. So that was a political sort of fight. And I think it's sort of blurred a little bit. Certainly at Paris, you saw more money beginning to be pledged, public money being pledged to adaptation. And you're now, I think there's this, you know, if you're at this sort of head of the World Bank level, there's this sort of thinking, well, you know, the money for helping countries to cut their emissions will come from the private sector, but adaptation will be from the public sector. So I think in terms of that sort of debate, for me, that was a sort of artificial political debate, and it now seems that you can actually talk about two things at the same time.
So has that altered the way that you covered this?
Yeah, I think we were always talking about adaptation, but I think we're going to be talking about it a lot more going forward.
There's an interesting asymmetry between mitigation and adaptation. So mitigation, right? You know, you're reducing emissions that's going to cost you, but it's going to benefit the whole world. And adaptation is you're putting into place measures that are going to benefit you. And so the local imperative to do better adaptation is very, very strong. The local imperative to do better mitigation is very weak. And so the international component to mitigation is far more important than the international component to adaptation, because people with enough money will adapt anyway. So the issue there is, do people have enough capital to invest in helping make their towns and communities and agriculture more resilient to the changes that are coming, or even to weather today?
Now, are you, I have to ask as a community, are you now just trying to explain to me, or are you trying to persuade me?
No, I mean, I'm not even talking to you.
Exactly. So may I take a question here?
Sure. So,
sorry.
No, that's good. It's fine.
we have a lot of young journalists in the room, and so what I wanted to know was, moving forward, how would you, Suzanne, want us journalists to, like, how do you see coverage changing, and how do you want us to be covering the climate change issue in the future? And then for Gavin, my question would then be, what questions aren't we asking you that you wish we were asking as far as covering climate science goes?
I think, for me, I think to, you know, watch what people are actually doing to fight climate change. Don't assume that people are not interested, that they don't think it's a real issue. I think that people do care. I think people are doing a lot more. But I think to go out into communities that are, you know, non-metropolitan communities, and think globally, go beyond the borders of this country if you can get the funding to do that. Go to poor communities here and see how people are dealing with things in sort of particularly vulnerable locations. You know, the U.S., the east coast of the U.S. is going to be hit very hard by sea level rise, but much worse than the global average. I saw something just the other day that there's a community in Louisiana that's going to be displaced. There's 400 and something communities in Native Alaskan communities that are going to be displaced. There's impacts that are coming that are here already with water. So I think get out of New York if you can, and go and see what's happening on the ground and how people are dealing with these challenges.
And then so for Gavin, the question of, usually my favorite last question in an interview, which is, well, what have I forgotten to ask you? Seriously, what are the questions you don't get?
So actually, I'm not going to answer that. What I'm actually going to say is, if you're looking for stories, go and talk to the young scientists who are doing stuff. Don't talk to the same old 10 people who get quoted in every single story in the national media, which includes me, right? Talk to the people who are at the cutting edge. Like, why are they doing what they're doing? What is actually going on? Why are they doing it in such poor conditions and being paid so little for it, and yet still doing it and still thinking that it's important, right? Dig down into those stories, because there are some great stories. There are some great characters that from all sorts of walks of life and attitudes, and those stories are not being told. And I think that those give you a much better insight into, you know, what science is, how the science enterprise exists, and how it interfaces with the real world on a topic that obviously has so many ramifications.
Very good. Would you have a question?
Yeah. Hi. So in a variation on the prevention versus mitigation discussion, one thing I've observed in covering climate change for longer than I'll say out loud is, I find readers respond in the sense that, being a digital reporter, I know that people read stories about solutions quite avidly, and it's a lot less predictable that they'll read a story about the problems, the scope of the problems. Like you said, some stories sink like a stone, you don't know why. Some just take off. But I'm trying to figure out, as I pitch stories, how do I pick and choose between those? Because I think the real story is that for every great thing that's happening, and for all the relief it gives me to report those stories, the real story is none of it's happening fast enough. And I'm trying to figure out how do we report that without sort of drowning our own, without sort of killing our own story before it's even had a chance to get out there.
Did you get that? Can you rephrase that as a more kind of sharp question, just so we can, I'm just want to make sure we answer it.
How do we balance between reporting on what people are doing in communities to solve climate change problems, whether it's cutting emissions or saving forests or mitigation, with the ongoing scientific beat that none of it's happening fast enough?
I think write more stories. You are not going to
Type
be
faster.
right.
Type faster.
No. But look, I look at from covering the sort of Israel-Palestine conflict, where we were filing a story every day, and one time you were looking at a suicide bomb in Jerusalem, and another time you were looking at an airstrike and the victims of an airstrike in Gaza. And people would say, where's your balance? Well, your balance isn't necessarily in every single story. Your balance is in your body of work.
Yeah.
Choose different things and do different things a lot. This is a huge topic. I stupidly thought that I'd be focusing on something when I moved to the environmental beat, but that is not at all the case. But this is a huge topic. Just balance does not come in a single story.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I would suggest is that there's a lot of people who are embedded within their communities, within their sectors, who are thinking about ways in which they could be moving faster. Find those people. And then work out why it is that they're not making progress, or if they are making progress, or what the incremental progress is. Those are interesting stories, because those are people who understand, what it is that they're dealing with, why they're doing it, and and then it's a process story. Why isn't it happening, right?
We have another question behind you.
Yeah, it's good that you just brought up Israel-Palestine, because my question actually, in a sense, relates to that. There's linkages a lot of the time between political conflicts and a scarcity of natural resources, but you don't see that being brought up very much in climate change stories. So why is that angle not being covered? Because it would bring both a different viewpoint, but also elucidate the connections between the two. And there's very few stories on that.
There's been very few stories, I think. I mean, you could talk about some of the science in that. There was,
Right.
there's some stories where they overemphasize the
Yeah.
linkage.
Yeah. I mean,
With Syria, for example,
Yeah.
the drought, the people migrating to cities. Those connections, I think it'd be fair to say that climate change was not the sole cause of the
course.
conflict in Syria.
Right.
The degree to which it's going to sort of increase the competition for scarce resources is something that's widely
So-
acknowledged in the defense establishment.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, the bigger issue is that climate on a lot of climate's impact on a lot of really big existing problems is multivariate and complex, and these are huge, complicated situations that we can't solve even if there wasn't a climate change component. Whether it's public health, whether it's urban policy, whether it's a conflict in the Middle East. Climate is kind of pushing on something that's totally unstable, and our ability to kind of just kind of segment out that and say, oh, this is a climate change story. It's not. It's just that everything has a climate change component, because climate affects everything, right? Weather,
It makes the bad situations worse.
Maybe it could make it better. I mean,
It tends to make the
yeah,
bad. Yeah.
I mean, like a drought generally tends to make things better, but there are places where you're going to get more rain.
But
so
you don't-
is
you
it going to
don't
make
think-
is it going to make those
But-
conflicts go away? It's not. clear.
But do you think there's an avoidance, if I understand his question, is there an avoidance of that as a story topic?
I think that there's a lot of people who are on different beats, who are on the political beat, who are on the war correspondent beat, who don't think of this. And you see this even in like a big organization like the Times. You know, they have totally different
The New York Times.
Yes. And you know, in the business section is talking about energy, but they don't actually go and ask anybody on the environment desk, you know, what the connection is to climate change or emissions. And so they have, you know, stories that are totally devoid of that climate context. It doesn't have to be that every story has to talk about climate change, but there's a lot of stories that get written that should have had a climate change component, at least in the back of their mind, but that doesn't get done. And I think you need to have people mingling more across news organizations.
I would agree with
Yeah,
that.
I mean, that's what I'm getting at, because there's no value in segmenting climate change out as a single isolated factor that's causing these conflicts, but instead it's being completely diminished and neglected from coverage. And so
often because the people who are writing the story don't know anything about it.
Also, it's hard to draw a straight line.
And it's very, very hard.
As it is with the big snowstorm or the unusual collection of tornadoes or the drought in California. I mean, you kind of know in the pit of your stomach, but that's not a source as journalists conventionally define it. So.
Agreed.
I want to change the subject just a tad, and then we'll get another question. Which is, you know, this is all nice. We're playing very well together here. I mean, we're on the same page. We're all concerned about the same things. But you know, journalists and scientists, journalists and communicators, public figures, we're cats and dogs. You know, I mean, so let's talk about rules of engagement for a moment. Okay. One of the things that's been interesting about the development and growth of the climate story as a coverage issue over time is that, you know, the ability of people to do things that just journalists used to do has expanded and broadened, become itself kind of a big factor. And let's use as an example of this hacking emails or filing FOI requests.
I've never hacked
well, no, I'm asking you because I know this is a subject close to your server. If a journalist does this, I mean, it's one of my stocks in trade, issuing an FOI request for all of your emails as a publicly funded whatever. And it's a good thing for me to do. But increasingly, it's also a political thing to do.
Yes.
And that is something I'm curious about from your standpoint. Do you just sort of see having your mail read as just the next phase of greater transparency as a publicly funded scientist?
Yes.
And from your standpoint, Suzanne, I'm curious, are you ambivalent about such information if it comes from a source that may have a political agenda? This is not uncommon in other areas.
Are you talking about using hacked emails? Or
well, not even just hacked emails, but
emails?
The initially the hacked emails that from the Hadley people, but then more increasingly in Congress and elsewhere, use of the Freedom of Information Act by people who have a different agenda, say, than Gavin here on the climate change. I'm hesitant to characterize them as. But,
no, go ahead, characterize them. Why the hesitancy?
Why the hesitancy?
Yes. So Energy and Environmental Legal Institute.
Oh, yeah,
the Competitive Enterprise Institute, the American Tradition Institute, Judicial Watch.
Yeah.
Why not characterize them? Western
values.
All the same people.
Well, they are. It's all
why not characterize them? They are politically motivated, agenda-driven,
paid
for and bought. Political operatives whose only role is to file totally spurious lawsuits that almost always get dismissed, but not before it takes up people's time, energy, and effort, and dissuades them from being public citizens.
Perhaps so, but it also produces, and it's not just in climate, which is why I wasn't characterizing. You now see this as a broader tool of discovery. I mean, in a legal sense, in other scientific controversies. So it's
a big problem because FOIAs are big stock and trade for journalists. They are our right. We're all supportive of transparency, and yes, they get abused, and certainly scientists feel that they're abused.
They are abused.
And for one of these, there was some of these FOIAs, I was included in them. So I mean, why would anyone care? to be honest, but the scientists were FOIA to see what email they had
sure,
exchanged with me.
sure.
Right.
I mean,
So
you know,
let me give you a couple of examples.
Yeah, please do.
But I don't. That said, I don't think you can shut down the FOIA process because it's abuse.
And okay,
Yeah.
so that's a straw man, right? So
Yeah.
that wasn't what was on the agenda. So,
Okay.
No, it wasn't,
FOIA, the law in this country, federal FOIA is actually a very good law. Case law on FOIA is really very good, and the tests that they have for what's releasable and what's not releasable are in the most part very, very sensible and have been well worked out since the Nixon era. But what's new is the use of FOIA as a way to shut down public discourse, to take people who have public profiles and just throw random FOIAs. I mean, there's no restriction on what you can ask for, and just keep throwing at them until they shut up, until they stop talking in public. And so you have it hasn't worked with me, right?
No,
so
it hasn't.
If they're watching, keep going, guys. But it has worked with other people who don't want to be, I don't want to have anything to do with them.
Is it the administrative burden, or is it the isolated, embarrassing word, or is it because the Senate is now doing this? It's come up in GMO debate. I mean, it's
if the Senate
a new tactic that is kind of grown out of the climate change.
If the Senate allowed themselves to be FOIA'd, that would be something.
Well, I guess they're using subpoena power, but
I know, but congressional members and senates are exempt from FOIA regulation, as you well know.
Indeed.
I wonder why.
Because people like Suzanne and I would have much too much fun.
Well, exactly. I mean, partly it's because people, scientists did not run for office. They did not put themselves forward as authorities in public. They emerged as public figures, and now some of us embrace that role. But when you emerge as a public figure, and then suddenly, bang, everybody is wanting to read every single one of your emails, regardless of whether it's part of your official duties or whether it was related to anything that you're actually doing in the conduct of your work, what happens is that people who basically just had one email address their entire life and conduct all of their email and all of their lives with one email address are suddenly finding their discussions with their tailors or their girlfriends or their students taken apart and ripped apart for a soundbite or for that. And it's let me tell you, it's very distressing. When CEI
Competitive Enterprise
they filed a lawsuit for all of my emails that mentioned my blog, and this kind of came out of the blue because for various reasons. And so one morning I know nothing is going on, next minute I'm being sued and there's 15 lawyers on the phone telling me exactly what I'm supposed to do. I have no idea what I'm supposed to do. I have no idea what my rights are. And I have no independent advice because they're all lawyers for my agency and not my own independent lawyer, because why would I have a lawyer? I'm a scientist. And that went on for 5 years before it was dismissed.
This was the 2007 suit?
It started in 2009.
And the judge, as I recall, ended up actually ruling, not completely, but sort of in your favor. You didn't have to.
Yeah. I mean, almost all of it was just thrown out. It was, frankly, one of the worst written lawsuits I've ever read, and now I've read a lot. These people, they're not good lawyers, and you immediately sense that they're not actually trying to get information. They're just trying to throw sand in the gears. And I was there. I had a lawyer in my office going through every single one of my emails for 3 weeks, and that's a very expensive thing that the federal government ends up paying for. And and all that, it's total silence, and then every so often she'd laugh. Ha ha! And I go, what? She says, no, that was funny. And she's going over our private conversations, our jokes that we had for it was like a 5-year period of emails, and it took 5 years for the whole thing to get dismissed.
And now, has that changed the way that you see yourself and the way that you behave as a scientist who engages in public communication about a controversial topic?
I now have more than one email address.
Does that solve the problem?
No, of course not. but the stuff that gets done on official time is much, you segregate your life in ways that you're now preparing for the next FOIA thing. And if you know that these things are coming, you can, stuff that's not work-related goes over here, stuff that's work-related stays there. And you are aware that anything you write could end up on the front page of the New York Times. And so obviously...
Or The Guardian, I want to give credit here.
Or The Guardian, conceivably. And so obviously you're now writing for a different audience. And so you don't write the same things that you would have written. And that happens to everybody who gets touched by this.
And just to sort of round it out, so Suzanne, as a journalist who covers climate change diligently for The Guardian, would you regard Gavin's emails differently as raw material for a story if it came from a group that you knew was a climate denialist group, or if it came through like your own FOI request? I mean, does it, or is it all grist? Does that source matter to you?
Does the source? The first thing that matters to us, I'm trying to think of any story that has actually.
No.
To be honest, I can't really think of any story that they've turned up. So I haven't
exactly.
I haven't actually seen a real story produced from this.
There's an incredible churn about the process.
Yeah, there's an incredible.
But they're not journalists. They're not trying to
They're
actually find out information.
They're not journalists.
I understand that, but I'm asking the journalist then.
So was it? It's so what are you saying? So if they were obtained legally, then you have to evaluate it on the basis of what the information was, and what was turned up. We're not going to deal with stolen goods. We're not going to deal with hacked material. We don't do that.
But you do.
What? Yeah. Well, that was different. That was a public interest thing. But I'm not going to, but.
There has to be a public interest if you're going to do that.
I agree that there's a public interest thing there with the other story, but I wonder how you draw the line.
But that's interesting. So are you saying, would I disregard the information if because of the source and because of the motivation of the source in turning it over?
No.
Is that what you're asking?
I'm just curious, yeah.
Yeah. I would have to sort of see what the information was, where it was coming from, and then how if it was verifiable, and the importance of the information. I would have to look at actually what it was. Look at the whole situation.
So Gavin is fair game.
I'm not asking for any special.
I'm not suggesting you are. I'm
trying to. This is an interesting debate because increasingly you are seeing scientific organizations pushing back against the FOIA process and
they're pushing back against the abuse of the FOIA process.
Right, but they're
trying to. So I mean, presumably you're talking about AGU or the Union of Concerned Scientists.
Yes.
The advice that they've given people is very sensible. Like there are rules. You don't have to do everything that somebody tells you have to do. There are legal precedents. You don't have to release everything. When you're attacked this way, there are different ways that you can approach this. And calling out institutions that are engaging in a shoot the messenger strategy should be called out. That should be a story. Why isn't that a story?
Well, we've written
I think it was a story. I think it was part of a broader story.
Yeah, but I think you do see, for example, there's now what you've got from the left, especially on the genetically modified food thing. You've now got organizations going after scientists and looking at corporate funding of scientists and whether that had any bearings on their conclusions. And you've got scientific organizations pushing back against that.
I think a lot of the pushback is because people have taken
but that's a legitimate
nuggets and totally spun them out of all context.
Well, I think that's one part of the process that we're talking about here. It's not a process that anyone is in complete control of.
Oh, true.
And the boundaries are changing.
Yeah, and the boundaries are changing in part because of what's happened in climate coverage. I mean, and in that regard, and I'm sorry for you, you were a part of a groundbreaking
you know what, other people had it much worse than me.
I know that too. We have a question here?
Sure, this is actually a question for all three of you. How would you characterize the quality of climate change coverage in 2016, and do you think it's improved?
So let's keep our answers terse because we're getting toward the culmination of this interesting evening?
I am not an optimist, or but I would say yes. I think it's getting better. I think it's really gotten better in the last few years. There's more coverage. There's more serious coverage as well. Yeah,
it goes in waves, and there was a wave around 2007 that was good, and then it kind of fell down the tubes in 2009, 2010, and it's coming back, and there'll probably be other waves as people's attention span moves onto other things, but right now we're in a relatively positive wave.
Yeah, I've covered climate off and on since 1988, and I've seen it go through these phases of kind of projection, prediction, empirical evidence gathering, grief, denial, rage, anger. And actually, I think we're in an acceptance mode, and I mean that both in terms of the scientific debates, I mean the legitimate scientific debates, and the international policy debate, and although it is the nature of journalism at any rate to focus on that moving point of conflict, because that's our job.
Right.
That moving point of conflict has indeed moved, and it's no longer about if, it's now about, or how, it's about what to do next. And that is progress, it seems to me.
I'd like to think so.
I wonder, we have 5 minutes, and you all have not had an opportunity to ask each other a question directly. So if you'd like to avail yourself of a quick question, now is your opportunity.
Ask me.
You first.
Ask me. I can't think of anything. You ask me something, I'll ask back, or I'll interrupt you. Whatever. But yeah.
So you mentioned to write a story, something has to have happened, right? There has to be some news issue. Obviously, when something happens, one could write a book about it, right? There's so much context that feeds into this that's happened before that other people have worked on, and yet you have to condense it down to the size of a standard newspaper story. To what extent are you able to go beyond that? Because now in the digital age, like this idea that everything has to fit into 12 inches, like that makes no sense anymore. And and even the Guardian, their print is.
She's going to need time for the answer.
I will tell you this. Well, first of all, everything is condensed. You can never say everything you want to say, and if in books, you always have to leave stuff out. Right. It's always about it's always about the editing. It's about what you leave out as much as you put in, because that makes what you put in that much sharper. But yes, I could write 3,000 words every day on every single topic for every single story. But we have metrics at The Guardian that tell us how much stuff gets read and what extent and how many, it'll actually say, well, it'll take the average reader 3 minutes to read this story, and what percentage of people spent that much time on the page, and how much time they actually read. And once you read that for a bit, you do realize that there are some stories that are short, there are some stories that are long, and the middle ground doesn't do so well on the internet as much. And you have to figure out where you want to make an impact, because you can do everything with the internet, and there's no limits physically. Well, in terms of sticking it into paper, there's limits to how many people can produce it. You have to think about in terms of impact and tailor your story accordingly.
So you use the magic word limits, and that was such a great question and such a wonderful answer. I'm going to draw our limit here and now. I want to thank everybody in this room. I want to thank those of you on the web who joined us, and I want to particularly thank you for your questions. You two have been fabulous, and I really appreciate the intelligence and good humor and mutual search for understanding of this very knotty and important question. So thank you.
Thank you.
And let me also remind those of you who are here in person, and also those of you who are online, let's reconvene 2 weeks from today, same time, same website, same hashtag, when we will be talking about physics. And I hope it will be just as serendipitous and fascinating as this conversation was. Thanks for joining us.